Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss, host of the program here called What's Going On AllPointsTV.com. And we're very glad to be with you again this afternoon at 2 o'clock. And we'll be staying around to about 3 for about an hour. And next week, we will proceed the program called Satura's Black History Corner that comes on the second and fourth Mondays of each month. And they are here from 3:30 to about 4 o'clock. But as always, we want to invite you to watch all the programs here at allpointstv.com because all the programs here we think are quality programs, and I can tell you right from my own experience here at the studio that they all are working hard to bring you a quality program. I just finished a few minutes ago one of the most important articles that I've done on Facebook, and I tried to interface this program with the one that we do on Facebook. And I'll be sharing some of those ideas that I wrote about, it wasn't even 30 minutes ago before I arrived here. And I want to share those ideas with you because I want to point out something that most persons in this country, if not almost all the persons in this country, are missing. It is really quite a scam that is in fact taking place in both political parties, but I'm going to pretty much place my comments in the context of what's happening in the Republican Party, since that's the going rate as far as what the public is focusing on, because that's where all the energy is now being expended, given the excitement of the, the insurgency of Donald Trump. So I'll focus on that, but really what I'll be saying about the Republican Party and the nomination process in that party pretty much holds true for the Democratic Party as well. The two parties are pretty much in lockstep with each other. And if you're paying attention to it, you'll see that that is true in terms of both parties are pretty much scratching each other's back, and they have each other's back. And when one party gets in trouble with an insurgency campaign, both parties surround that, and they try to put that fire out, or to, in fact, lessen the impact of that insurgent campaign. And you see them doing that and coalescing around the campaign that Donald Trump is putting in place. I hope they make it clear about why that is in fact going on before we get off the air this afternoon. You wonder where to start when you begin to try to open up a process that is so hidden and so manipulative. It's very clever, and you have to wonder about how do you begin to explain it, because there are a lot of different corridors in it, and because it's so out of sight, yet it is cleverly disguised in public view. And the challenge would be this afternoon to try to explain it, given the complexity of it, but simplistic if you know what it is that you're looking at, because it's really hidden in plain view. And a lot of people think that it's a conspiracy by some other forces that we can't see. I had an argument this past week in Detroit, as a matter of fact, at a museum where I was one of the persons that was there, and a lot of people were thinking that we were talking about some invisible apparatus. The invisibility is the invisibility is really the hidden hand. It's not so much another apparatus in place as one you're looking at, but what is underneath it, what discerned, can I use that word, was not being discerned, is how it actually operates. In other words, what is visible is not all of what is there. You only see a certain part of it, but you have to be able to understand how that interfaces that which is not really shown, but is really the same apparatus. A lot of people think it's something other than this apparatus that is visible, because it does have certain hidden and shadowy components to it, which I hope to explain how it operates from behind the scenes, because it's really becoming more and more clear every day with the insurgent campaign of Donald Trump. Let me start off by saying this. Yesterday on a couple of programs, one of which was the one that is hosted by George Stephanopoulos, they had Donald Trump on the program yesterday complaining about the fact that it's not fair for him to have to get a majority of the delegates, which would total 1,237 delegates out of a total delegation of 2,400 1,472 delegates. So the way you arrive at the 1,237 is that you take 1/2 of that number plus 1. And what Donald Trump doesn't realize is that he has taken an undemocratic position. But what I'm going to try to show here is that the undemocratic position that he's taken has been imposed upon the process through a manipulation behind the scenes, and that they have Donald Trump actually taken an undemocratic position, but the undemocratic position is built into the process. And I hope to explain that. But I want to do some numbers first of all, and the numbers that I want you to keep in mind is the number of persons that it takes in order for a candidate to win the majority. If you go to the convention with majority of delegates, since there are 2,472 delegates that are in the delegation process in the Republican Party, then if you take 1/2 of that, which is 13, which would be 1,236, you add 1 to it because you have to have the majority, so it's 1/2 plus 1, that gives you that number 1,237. Now, Donald Trump said yesterday on the air that it's not fair to require that because of the number of candidates that were running for the nomination. He said there were 17 candidates. Of course, it's now down to 3, but it started out with 17 candidates. And the question is, how does anyone get a majority given that number? But let me tell Donald Trump something that he's missing. It would be almost impossible to do it if you only had 2 candidates. And Donald Trump is looking at the problem as being the sheer number of candidates we're running, when the problem would be there regardless as to the number of candidates. And let me tell you why that would be the case. Because here's the hidden factor. I told you that there are 2,472 total delegates. But here's where the scam is, which Donald Trump has not recognized, and doesn't even recognize how the hidden, I'm going to say hidden forces, but it's really the hidden political shysters that are behind the scenes manipulating the political process, and they're doing it in the Republican Party also. And if you understand what is happening in the Republican Party, you understand how it operates in the Democratic Party the same way. But there's some differences in it, but it's the same type of setup. And I'll tell you why that exists also. It doesn't matter how many you have running. Donald Trump thinks it's the sheer number of a person that was outside, that was running in the network, trying to earn and win the nomination through the majority of delegates. The problem is that wherein the whole number of delegates is 2,472 delegates, underneath the radar, 115 of those delegates are taken out of the mix, and the candidates are asked to take 1/2 of a whole when the whole doesn't exist. Because you take 115 delegates out of it, they're not really vying for 2,472 delegates. They're vying for 2,472 delegates minus 115 delegates that are over here out of view, that are not in the process. So even if you have 2 candidates running for the presidential office, it is impossible for them to get a majority if they split it right down the middle, and they have +1, because the majority that they're pursuing does not exist within the whole, because the whole would be minus the 115 delegates that's put over here to the side, out of sight, that they can't even vie for. So then they got Donald Trump. Donald Trump is talking about a plurality and saying the plurality is what they should require. If he goes to the convention with more votes than anyone else has, then because nobody else, let's say Cruz, for example, would not be close, then his plurality should, in fact, rule the roost, so to speak. But the problem with that, and the reason why that is a certain amount of political delirium, is what I call it, is that they got Donald Trump acting undemocratic when the process is the undemocratic process. But they got him talking, unbeknownst to himself, talking in undemocratic terms, because here's what happens if that prevails. If Donald Trump goes there with a plurality but does not have the majority, which is almost impossible to get, even if you only have two candidates, because the sleight of hand I'm trying to explain to you that's going on. The whole doesn't even exist. They're competing for votes in a whole when the whole doesn't exist. It's an illusion that exists, and I'll explain why that's in place, and why that is one of the more clever things that's going on in a scam, in a political process that's made to look democratic but is undemocratic. And those that are inside of it are caught up in an undemocratic process in which they are talking in terms that are not democratic terms. But the cause of it is something beyond their means and understanding. And we're going to talk about it from a lot of different points of view of those who are on the other radio networks, Mark Levine and Glenn Beck and some of those persons who are basically talking nonsense also. And they're talking out of their heads as well. And I'll try to bring them into discussion as well. These people are basically numbskulls. They're good in some areas, but they're practically numbskulls in terms of not understanding what they're talking about in terms of how the process operates. Mark Levine, for example, talks about Donald Trump is trying to suborn the democratic process because he's saying that he should be able to win a nomination without a majority of the delegates. And of course, that is in fact true. What Mark Levine doesn't understand and does not recognize is that the majority of the whole doesn't exist because of what I just told you a few minutes ago. The 115 delegates have been taken out of the process. And so what looks like the whole 2,472 delegates is not in the mix. They've been taken out and removed and placed somewhere else above the above or below the threshold of the understanding of the candidates, and also above or below the threshold of the voting public, who thinks they're voting for the 2,472 delegates when they're not. You subtract 115 from that, and that's the number of delegates that's out there. The 115 are hidden away somewhere else as delegates that are not in the purview, nor do they allow them to vote on it, as kind of like an overarching group of delegates over the system managing the network. And that management is not democratic. That's autocratic. You can say that is even communist or socialist, but it's certainly not democratic, because the voters do not have the chance, quite frankly, whatever the number of persons running, they don't have the ability to import a majority under most circumstances, because the whole doesn't exist, and therefore dividing it by one half by even just two players becomes almost a practical impossibility, because you're talking about one half of a whole that is an illusion. It's a clever scam. And I probably am the only one that's talking about it in the country. And I wrote about it more coherently than I will probably be able to explain it in verbal terms, because you can do it in words. You can go around it and make sure you got all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed. But in terms of verbalizing it, some things you may not, in your discourse, you might leave some of the parts of it out. But I will try to surround the point and come back to it a number of times in order to make it coherent to those who are looking at this analysis for the first time. But it is a clever scheme that they have in place. It's very clever. And the person that really opened it up a little bit is one of those delegates, by the way. The one is in North Dakota, the guy by the name of Curly Hoagland, who is one of those delegates that made this comment last week, and people probably read his comment, and I don't think he even understood that he was giving away the store, but that wasn't his intent. He was just simply saying that he told one of the, it I think it was on MSNBC. He was saying that the voters do not vote for the nominee of the Republican Party. The Republican Party makes that decision. And so the lady asked him, the interview, because I don't watch MSNBC, so that was kind of, I saw it on the internet. But she asked him, because it surprised her that he would say that, and she asked him, well, if the voters are not choosing the nominee, then what are the primaries about and why are people voting? His answer was, that's a good question. Now, he's not part of that's going on in the booth, in the back, in the dark. He's not part of that. He is the person that's on the more exterior part of it as the person who is being used. I shouldn't say being used. He's the part of the network of those like ourselves who are the useful idiots. But he's a useful idiot in a different way than we are the useful idiots that, in fact, go and buy into that we are actually making the decision. Let me tell you something. They have never released their ability to control the decision making. So what is that process really about? It's really about seeming to release it to the public, so the public is deciding upon who the nominee is going to be when it's impossible for them to decide that. Practically impossible. If you go back and look at these conventions all the way back to China, I don't mean going to China now, I mean going back in the time, you will see that, let's say the last 10 conventions, you'll see that all of them have been potentially brokered conventions. They don't call it brokered anymore, though. They call it contested. Out of those 10, 3 of them in the Republican Party that we're talking about, but I'm saying you can also extrapolate the same thing in the Democratic Party because it works the same way. They have superdelegates over there, and they identify them as superdelegates. Over here, you have the 115 hidden delegates. But there are superdelegates also, and why are they there? To oversee and to be able to cancel out and neutralize the process in the hands of the voters who think they're deciding anything, but that's an illusion. They're not deciding anything. It's an illusion that they're deciding it. It's really kind of clever when you think about it, because it's the idea is to make it appear that you're releasing the authority and the decision making to those who are the voters, while retaining it in a very clever form where there's no power being given out here at all. Just the voting has been given. The decision making is not that, because it doesn't have the power to actually determine it, given how it's set up. What Trump doesn't see is what I'm saying here is that Trump doesn't see that he's talking in undemocratic terms, but that manipulation of his voice comes out of the fact that he's involved in an undemocratic process he's caught up in, where the numbers cannot be accrued, and therefore he's talking in undemocratic terms. Here's how the undemocratic terms are in which he's talking. Let's say, for example, he goes to the convention and he only has a plurality. What Trump is contending is that if he goes to the convention and he has more votes, let's say 500 more, 400 more than the next contender, he's saying the plurality should therefore rule the roost, and he should in fact prevail because he has so many more votes than does, in this case here, Ted Cruz. But if that prevails, what is happening there is that more persons did not vote for Donald Trump than voted for Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump is then asking for the disenfranchisement of all the ones who didn't vote for him, because then if he didn't have the majority, then the majority didn't vote for Donald Trump. And the plurality is Trump's call for undemocratic principles to prevail in the process. He doesn't see that the process is undemocratic. And his voice, he doesn't see, therefore, comes out of that. So therefore, Donald Trump is speaking in a state of delirium, political delirium, that is not of his making, but in fact caused by the manipulation. Understand that. You see, you see, I'm kind of like a little bit more out of the box in what happens in terms of analysis than these persons who think that they are really, smart. And they are smart, but they're not analytically smart. They're smart in terms of being able to read something and then to be better read than some of the others. And I was listening to Glenn Beck last week, who called on this program. I don't listen to Beck. I think Beck has, lost it. He's lost his way. I don't know where it would have occurred. Might have been once he was thrown off the air from Fox. I don't know when it would have occurred, but I can tell you this, that he's speaking in a state of delirium also. Glenn Beck called John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, called him the SOB word for not getting out of the race, presumably so that Ted Cruz could have a direct line to Donald Trump to show him a what for in debates, because Ted Cruz was supposed to be some great debater at Harvard University. And I have to pause right here and say this. Recently there was a report that Harvard University went up against a debate team and lost. This was not even, 2 or 3 months ago. It's okay to lose to a debate team, but Harvard University is supposed to be the best university in the country. And the debate team didn't lose to another one of the Ivy League universities, lost to a debate team of the persons on that debate team who are incarcerated in a prison somewhere. And they lost. Harvard University lost. And this is not the movie version in The Great Debater starring Denzel in the movie called The Great Debaters. Where they had, it was really Wiley College, and the debate team was really the team over, I think was USC, a school in California. And they made it Harvard in the film because they wanted to give it more credence that they had really accomplished something by defeating the best that was out there. But it was this black school went up against against a predominantly white school, and it might have been at that time an all-white school. I'm not really sure. Probably was not given the fact of its location, but it was certainly a predominantly overwhelmingly white university. But they made it Harvard in the film. Well, this is really Harvard University in this case, because the school that prison debate team went up against was Harvard University. In the film, it was a fictional school imported, but the debate itself was real. They did win the debate, but it was not against the so-called formidable debate team there. And I want to bring that in to show, to point out that this idea that Ted Cruz being on the debate team in Harvard University would have cleaned somebody's clock would assume that he is doing well and doing great things on the debate that we've had on these different networks, and we've seen no evidence that this man has in his skills higher than the other skills, or has been just knocking them down and dragging them out and winning these debates hands down, and nobody's been close, when that has not been the case. And this idea that if Kasich gets out, that it would be between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, and that would give Ted Cruz a pathway to the nomination, which they want to bring about because they're against Donald Trump. And what Beck doesn't understand is that by Kasich staying in, that more than anything else would stand to block Donald Trump, because the more you have in the mix, the more difficult it is to have the candidate win the number of votes, the more persons in it. You see, what happens is that if you have 17 candidates, for example, it's not impossible for the candidate to get a majority is just more difficult. But it's also difficult if you just have two candidates. So what Beck is doing, because he doesn't understand what he's dealing with, is that he is calling for two candidates. That gives, if with the number of delegates still left, about 1,000 delegates still left, and you need 1,237 delegates, with 1,000 still available, if you divide that between two persons rather than three persons, the pathway for Donald Trump, which you're trying to block, becomes a little easier for him to block. He needs about 52% of the votes, of the delegates that are left. If you have just two candidates vying for it, split that down the middle, and if he gets 500 of the 1,000 pluses out there, he's got 600 already. And so if you add the 600 some odd that he already has and add the 500 to it, and you need 1,237, then how close would that be to the number that he needs? In other words, getting down to two rather than to have three out there doesn't make it easier for Trump to be stopped. It makes it more difficult for Trump to be stopped. And so Beck is wrong on that. And let me tell you what Kasich response has been to that particular idea. He's quoted as saying yesterday that if he had gotten out of the race before Ohio and Trump had won both Florida and won Ohio on the 15th when they had the third Super Tuesday, and all of them are now becoming Super Tuesday because it puts if it's not sealed at the primary level, then some other things are going to kick in at the convention. So these are all these are Super Tuesdays. He said that if on the 15th, which is the third Super Tuesday, the 1st, the 8th, and the 15th, and the next one coming up tomorrow, the 22nd, he said if he had gotten out of the race and Donald Trump had won both Florida, and he got all 99 of the votes in Florida, and would have gotten the 66 in Ohio if Kasich had not been running, then Kasich is saying that the deal would have been sealed already, and therefore he told persons yesterday, chill. He said, chill. In other words, Kasich knows what he's doing. He doesn't understand this part of the process, but he does know that he's playing the role that needs to be played if they're going to block Donald Trump. So he's telling these other persons out here that don't understand that it takes two in the song by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. You know, it takes two, baby, but it takes more than two given what's happening in the political process right now. 3, 4, 5, whatever the numbers would be, that's to the good of those who are trying to stop Donald Trump. Kasich understands that. He doesn't understand much else, but he understands that part. So he's a blocking agent, understanding that his role is primary, because he really thinks that once it gets to the convention and everybody is kind of rigidly placed in stone to go to the convention and vote for the person whom they are pledged to, but only in the first ballot. Not in ballot number 2, but in the first ballot, they are pledged to the delegates they're going to the convention to vote for. But that pledge is broken after the first ballot doesn't prevail. And they can't prevail because unless they make an agreement before the convention, nobody will have a majority of the delegates there. Everybody will have their own delegates going into the process. Rubio, who is not even in the process anymore, retains the delegates who voted for him when he was in the process. I don't know if anyone else except Carson had some delegates, but very few others have any delegates. The ones that have delegates are Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, John Kasich. Ben Carson has some delegates. Not that many, but he has some. Lindsey Graham didn't have any. Skywalker didn't have any. Look at how many persons didn't have any. So when he says there were 17 candidates, let's look at how many persons. See, that's why I'm telling you that that's a flawed analysis, because a lot of those persons he's talking about, the 17, didn't have any of those, doesn't have any delegates. I mean, they didn't earn any of the numbers. So that does not, it looks like to Donald Trump that the 17 divide the numbers up. But that's not true. Look how many of them have delegates. That's not the problem. He thinks it's the problem. It's not. The problem is that there's an elephant in the ointment, and the process is in fact a scam. Trump thinks it's that they had too many persons running. If that were the case, then you would have to have all these persons running, 17 in number, taking away some of the delegates. You think that's what happened? You think? Can you go in and investigate that to see if that's true? That's not true. That's not even real. But what's even less real than that is the process itself, which is not real. Because you see, the whole that they think they're competing for, which is made up of 2,472 delegates, that's not real. That's an illusion. And you're not getting a half of the whole because the whole itself doesn't exist. That's how clever they are. And that's what everybody in the country is missing. Everybody. These people are very clever. And I have to tell you something, this book by Larry Klayman, he doesn't go into this analysis, but he does have a word to describe who they are. And it describes what you're dealing with. And I only mention this on the air, not to be profane, but because of the name of his book. He has a book here called Whores: Why and How I Came to Fight the Establishment, as he understands it. But the name of his book is as real as it gets. He should put the word in front of it, though, that in front of the word he uses to name his book, he should put in the front of it the word political. And I would put another word in back of the word political. I put political monsters. These are monsters that you're dealing with. They could care less about democracy. And over there in the Republican Party, you have the female version of Reince Priebus, who is the RNC, meaning the Republican National Chair. That is more or less the role of a whip. You know, that he plays the role of the Republican network as a whip of the network. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz plays the same role in the Democratic Party. Now, why would she be the female version of Priebus? Because in the Democratic Party, the idea is that they are more appreciative, more sensitive, more caring of women's issues. You know, they were throwing, in the Republican Party, they had that one commercial where they advertising the Democratic Party being better than the Republican Party. They had throwing grandmother over the cliff, not granddad, grandmom. They like women over in the Democratic Party, and it shows by the fact they have Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, representative from Florida, and she also serves as the DNC, the Democratic National Chairwoman. Why? Because the Democratic Party has one of its major constituency groups. They have three major constituency groups: women, they care so much about them; blacks, love them to death. I mean, the party of the Klan love them some black folks. And don't forget, not just women, not just blacks, and all minorities therein, but they are for the working class. Look at these unions and the people who are trying to get their dinner secured And look at the fact that they got to go on Wall Street and take them on. Don't forget they're being financed by them. And, and they just so much for the working man, right? And Bernie Sanders, who's getting they're feathering his campaign, but he's going to take on these billionaires, and they have got to be dealt with because they're taking food away from the working class and keeping them poor. And the Democratic Party is going to go in there and stop all of this, and Wall Street's the problem. And he's a democratic socialist, but that's not the problem. The problem is capitalism. And so you have this game going on over there, but it's really the same game, but it has a different complexion, because if it's the same complexion in both parties, then you'll know that there is a coordinated effort to pull the wool not only over people's eyes, but over their entire head. Let me just tell you another thing that you're looking at. You notice that the Republicans are saying that if Donald Trump is a nominee, they're going to vote the party because he's not conservative enough, and they will vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think that Hillary Clinton is more conservative than Donald Trump? Let me phrase it a little bit differently, because I would give the Vermont senator a lot more credit than I give to Hillary Clinton, because he at least will get close to who he is. He talks about himself being a democratic socialist, and I can tell you right now that doesn't even exist. You can't be a socialist, be a Democrat. You can't. You can talk about being that before you get into power, but the fact that you're a socialist means a state, and a state is force, and that is not democratic. The state is autocratic. And so this idea he's a democratic socialist is nothing other than another part of this mirage we're talking about, this illusion that's in place here in terms of how these people in the political process, these W word that he uses here in Larry Klayman's book, it's another part of the facade that's in place. And so they care so much, right? So they got Debbie Wasserman Schultz over there, the woman, and they got a man over here, and look how they over here, and so on and so forth. But they're saying over here where they have Reince Priebus, that if Donald Trump is a nominee, they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton. But they're only going to do it because he's not a conservative. So we're going to vote over here for a person that is running under the Democratic Party label, but she now talks about herself being a progressive. And what do you think that means? And when it's not progressive, then it's liberal. And what does that mean? And Bernie Sanders is a socialist Democrat, a democratic socialist. And so I have to ask the question, okay, what does that mean also? And what it all means is the same thing, is that which is not being said, but the hidden hand, so to speak, or what it all means. Because whether you talk about liberal, progressive, Democrat, democratic socialist, it's all the same thing. The state. And at least Bernie Sanders gets close to identifying who he really is. Who he really is a communist. And so is Hillary Clinton. And really, let's be honest here, the only people who are not communists are those who are not in pursuit of political power. I make that comment. I made it down at the museum this past weekend in terms of being down there with a group called MOVE. They had this one person down there who was one of the ones to survive the MOVE, this group called Africa. Everybody had the name Africa in the last part of the name. They were the ones that were bombed in Philadelphia in 1978 under Frank Rizzo, who was the mayor at that time. And then they had this other flake coming in. He became the mayor because they voted him. People vote in Philadelphia voted Frank Rizzo out because they didn't like the way he handled the move. They had guns and that most of them didn't work. Just a lot of it was just air campaigns. But they were doing some things they shouldn't have been doing in terms of blaring. Had speakers out and blaring over the neighborhood, all this profanity and all of that. So they didn't have the support in the community. And so, but they handled them. But Frank Rizzo handled them inappropriately, and so the people went and voted Frank Rizzo out, and they put Wilson Good in there, the black mayor. And the black mayor came in there using the same words that have been used by Malcolm X. They were saying, "Well, what are you going to do with the group called Move Africa?" Was like the name of the group. And he said, "We're going to root them out of there by any means necessary." He had actually taken the words of Malcolm X and flipped it and put it into the establishment and was using it as a civil force or a state force. And he also did even more so. They bombed that place under Wilson Good, burned up children in that village. Don't think it's racial. It's not racial. It's not even Democrat or Republican. If you think it is, go out there and look in Oregon. Anybody that's walking around here talking about the Democrat and Republican, these are the children who are in grown folks' business. The grown folks are not into any of that. That's why they can go over and cross the lines and vote and say they'll vote for Hillary Clinton. The claim is, underneath the radar, the claim is that they are concerned about Donald Trump not being conservative. Now, if that were the case, you would agree with me that if that were the case, they could not go over there and vote for someone who's less conservative than Donald Trump is. That can't be the reason. The reason is something different. And the reason is that by going over into vote for Hillary Clinton and helping her become president of the United States does not, in fact, in any way she does not inject herself into where they have political power, because they don't have political power in the Democratic Party. Their political power is in the Republican Party. And Donald Trump, if he becomes president of the United States, becomes president inside of the party where their power has its foundational tenets. And that's their problem, not Hillary Clinton. And that's why they'll go across the line and vote for Hillary Clinton. But the umbrella they're using to disguise what this is really about, selling it to the American people as if it's about political power or political parties, when it's really about political power, is that they're saying that the reason for doing so is to go over and vote for her because he's not conservative enough, as if she's more conservative, and the other part of that, as if they're conservative. Where does the word rhino come from? If they are conservative, the assumption is the Republican Party is the conservative party. The fact is that neither one of the parties is conservative. Just like you finding out that Fox, how they give you a choice, like there's this choice and that choice, just like you're finding out that Fox Network is not a conservative station. It only appears to be conservative because what it's up against is so much to the left that anything that's not over there to extreme left is to the right necessarily. So because you can't go over there on that side unless you're going completely to Moscow or to Beijing. Anything that's not over to the extreme is to the right, and people think because it's to the right, it means it's conservative. It's not conservative. It's liberal also, but not as. You were talking about degrees of liberalism. The whole network is a liberal network, and it is not conservative. That's why you use words like rhinos. You think the Republican Party is a conservative, party. It's not. And they'll say Republican in name only. What they really mean by that is that the Republican Party is supposed to be a conservative party. And therefore, these persons not being conservative, they are Republicans in name only. Let me tell you something out here in the listenership and the viewership. The Republican Party and those who are affiliated with it are Republicans in name only, in the sense that the name Republican means something specific. Go look at Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. And you'll see where it says in there that you are guaranteed, all states are guaranteed, a Republican form of government. Republican meaning that you choose your representatives who will be the embodiment of your voice in government. So that collectively there is a Republican form of government because the voice of the people collectively is embodied and embraced in their political leadership. And that's what Republicanism is, because they are the representatives of the collective body politic, or the collective will of the whole body. They are Republicans. And that doesn't exist. In the Democratic Party, the idea is they are discerning what is the majority voice that is in place in the political apparatus, and they are representative of that voice, so that wherever the majority voice is, and it can be discerned, and when is it not discerned? Because we know, for example, that there are a lot of issues that come up where a majority is on one side, the polls indicate it, and the minority is on the other side. And you see how many times does the majority voice prevail, which is the 12th or never. The majority voice never prevails. The voice of the political elite prevails, and it prevails absolutely, while making it appear that they are representing the voice and will of the people. I mean, this is what Lincoln talked about on November 19th, 1863, when he said, "And government of the people, by the people, and for the people should not perish from the earth." And you see these presidents keep on repeating that, right? Some will repeat it and say that this nation under God, now Barack Obama wouldn't say that, he'd say this nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. But most of them would say this nation, one nation under God, indivisible, and go on with the rest of it. Government of the people, by the people, for the people should not perish from the earth. And when Lincoln said that in 1863, on November the 19th, he was saying that on the graves of people at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania that had died fighting a war, not maintaining government of the people, by the people, and for the people, because they were fighting against people who were in fact carrying out that genre in terms of government of the people, by the people, and for the people, because the people there in those southern states had decided that they were going to, in fact, remove themselves from their voluntary alignment with the Union, because they no longer felt the Union was representing the interests for which they had come together in 1788 and ratified the Constitution to carry out the tenets of what was there in the claims made in the Constitution. It had nothing to do with slavery. It had to do with the fact that they had come into a proposition in what Charles Beard talked about in his book called A Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, and they were rising up because the economic claims for which they had joined together made excellent sense to them to join in, because there was a fiduciary and economic interest that benefited all of the 13 colonies at that time. And then given what was happening thereafter, where a certain section of the country was in fact benefiting, another part of the country was not benefiting, they felt that they were paying for the benefit of another section of the country, and they decided to in fact withdraw their approval of the association. And so the government of the people, by the people, for the people was making a decision that was in their interest to set up another unity that in fact recognized and represented that interest, and this did not do it. And they were militarily confronted to stop that in what is called a civil war in the United States, which is another scam because it's not a civil war. A civil war is something different also, isn't it? A civil war is where persons are vying and fighting over political control in the same land space. And secession does not reach that criteria to be defined as that. When people are succeeding and leaving, therefore, from the boundaries, they're not competing for political power in a geopolitical unity. They are trying to exit out of it, and they were militarily confronted to stop from doing that. That's not a civil war. That's a war of secession they're fighting. And when Lincoln was saying that in 1863, government of the people, by the people, for the people, he was actually standing against the principle militarily to make sure that did not prevail. And that puts Lincoln in a whole different context too. It makes of him what Clayman is talking about. The reality is almost nothing of what we're being told. It doesn't resemble any of this. It resembles something else that is not being discerned. I have a lot of friends that argue with me all the time. I went down to Detroit with some of my friends, by the way, in this forum. And they were arguing all the way down there and all the way back. You got one person that argues all the time about the invisible force. I asked them to go and look at these pictures of these guys like Napoleon, for example, and ask yourself, and you can go look at King George III the same way, and ask yourself the question, why those guys always have their shirt buttoned up and always have their hand inside, their right hand inside their shirt, button shirt. They're not patting themselves on the stomach. They are speaking to the brotherhood of power. And people think it's some globalist, structure. The globalist is each one having a certain part and ownership of that part of the globe where they are. I mean, Wilson was not allowed to get into the League of Nations, was he? He wanted to get into it, and they said no. And if the people behind the scenes were, in fact, regulating and controlling it and so on and so forth, then it was the persons that had brought in the 17th Amendment in 1913. The Federal Reserve System was put in place in 1917. The 16th Amendment was put into the Constitution as an amendment of Article 1, Section 2, and it was put in the Constitution as an amendment which gave the right of the federal government to, in fact, tax directly people's income, the income tax. That was put in 1913. So why then, when Wilson wanted to get the UN involved in the League of Nations, 5 years later, when the war came to a close, and the war had come to a close 1 year after 1917, we got involved in the war in 1917. Why then the United States joined the League of Nations at that time and were forbidden to do so if the umbrella was above them and they were, in fact, making the decision, but the group above them wanted to have this global operation put in place and so on and so forth. I'm saying that the view is flawed. Griffin's view is flawed in The Creature of Jekyll Island. It's a good book. But Griffin wants to import the bankers into it, the network into it. That's their funding stream. But the bigger funding stream that we're talking about here, you're talking about these persons on Wall Street, that's what Bernie Sanders is talking about. All of that is misdirection. Do those persons on Wall Street have, no matter how much money they got, we're talking about billions, but do they have trillions? The banking stream that I'm talking about is a banking stream that comes into the network every year of $3.3 trillion. And they're not satisfied. I'm talking about these people that are visible, but the hidden hand, that hand inside the shirt. The hidden hand, the one that actually makes the decision and then is able to hide the fact that they are making the decision where it looks like somebody else is making it, because visibly you don't see how it operates because what they put in place is not what's really there. These are magicians that are able to make reality disappear. And so it looks like somebody else is guiding it because you elect these people. Look what, they're not doing anything. They are in fact just doing what is in fact visible. But look at what's happening in the process being revealed to you right now in terms of what's happening with this insurgency by Donald Trump. And Donald Trump poses an exponential threat because it is a relationship between the two visible parties, which are actually over $3.3 trillion every year. And all they're fighting over is who's going to be the majority group that's going to decide how that is going to be split up, with them giving it to constituents so they can maintain themselves in power. What people do not understand and do not recognize is that neither political party ever loses. They just lose elections. They never lose. And in fact, it's very important for them to lose elections so that the monopolistic aspects of power in the country will not look as if to be monopolistic, because it gives a valve to be able to make a change in the political order that looks like they're changing the political system, when what you're changing is a political party, but the system is not changed. It's very clever when you think about it. And what they're talking about is something that's within the context of the illusion that's been created by very clever, very sophisticated, very cunning and deceitful. That word, put political in front of it, because these people are very good at what they do. And Levine and those guys are talking about, well, that's not the process. They're right. Donald Trump is calling for a suborning of the democratic process, but the democratic process doesn't exist. Donald Trump didn't create that. Donald Trump is in fact trapped in it. And he is talking undemocratically, unbeknownst to himself. He's talking in undemocratic terms, but the process is where the problem is. The process is not democratic. And they got him talking about disenfranchising those persons didn't vote for him, because the majority, if he didn't have a majority going into that convention, it means that he is not going to the convention with majority of the vote. So that means that in his own view, or lack therein of discernment, he is talking about disenfranchising all the people that didn't vote for him, which is the majority of the people that voted. And so Donald Trump is talking undemocratically in terms of talking about the plurality that he has received as a vote. I mean, what the heck is going on here is a question I raised in my post today. And I raise it in the public mind about what's going on here, because this is very sophisticated stuff that you're dealing with. And we have to understand it in order to correct it, because it's very clever, extremely clever. And I wonder, quite frankly, if anybody in the country understands that. Certainly Mark Levine doesn't understand. He doesn't talk about it. He talks about Trump because he's a Ted Cruz supporter. That Trump that's not the process. And Reince Priebus yesterday said, here's what he did yesterday that's quite clever as well. He said, well, in order for me to be the chairman of the RNC, I had to go through seven different balloting before I came out as a chairperson. In other words, what's good for the chairperson is good for the others also. But you didn't vote on him becoming the RNC. And that's a whole different discussion about why that's true. He, in fact, went through a different thing. You didn't go and vote for it. It was just that the party decided. Because the party controls the apparatus. The Republican Party controls the Republican apparatus, Democratic Party controls that apparatus. And they never relinquish control, only appearing to do so. And that's what we're dealing with right now. And what we got to overcome if we're ever going to develop a system in which the people's voice can get through. Right now it cannot get through. We'll see what happens. Pay attention to what's taking place in the next 19 different primaries. We'll see if the 1,237 delegates is reached as a milestone. If not, we'll watch the convention, see what happens there. Okay. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream. Because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.